Let's unravel the story. The movie begins with a man named Michael, who is seen digging through the ice in the middle of a vast frozen landscape. Michael had survived a plane crash, leaving him stranded in the Arctic Circle. After setting up an SOS signal, he checks his fishing line. The movement of the line indicates that he has caught a fish, his only source of food. With no way to cook, he has no choice but to eat the fish raw, like sushi. After finishing his meal, Michael grabs his communication device and sets out toward a higher vantage point. Michael hikes across the icy terrain, hoping to find a better location for a signal. He turns on his device, but his disappointment is clear. It's not working. Realizing he won't make progress today, he decides to try again tomorrow. As he walks back, he looks out over the frozen landscape and sees just how far he is from civilization. Exhausted, he returns to the wreckage of his plane and decides to sleep early to conserve his energy and food supply. The next morning, Michael is seen clearing off a pile of rocks, revealing a grave, his wife's resting place. After a moment of silence, he resumes his daily routine. However, when he checks his fishing area, he panics. His supply box has been destroyed. Inspecting the scene, he is horrified to find polar bear tracks. Fearful that the bear is still nearby, Michael runs back to his plane for safety. Realizing that simply waiting won't help him survive, Michael forces himself to continue his routine. He hikes to higher ground and attempts to use his device again. From a distance, he spots movement. It's the polar bear. Fortunately, the bear doesn't notice him, so he quietly retreats to his plane. The next day, Michael wakes up earlier than usual. He checks his fishing trap, then heads back to higher ground to try his communication device again. As he turns the crank, he notices dark storm clouds approaching. He decides to pack up quickly, but just as he's about to leave, he sees something incredible. His device has finally picked up a signal. Overjoyed, he looks up to see a helicopter approaching. Desperate to get rescued, he runs toward it, waving and setting off a smoke signal. But fate isn't on his side. The extreme weather causes the helicopter to lose control and crash. In shock, Michael sprints toward the wreckage, hoping the damage isn't too severe. Unfortunately, the pilot hasn't survived. However, as he checks the wreckage, he finds a woman who is still alive but severely injured. Michael quickly gathers the first aid supplies from the helicopter and does his best to treat the woman's wounds. Though in pain, she responds slightly, a sign that she's still fighting to survive. With the storm intensifying, Michael decides to stay the night there to protect her. The next morning, Michael is relieved to find the woman still alive. Starving, he searches the helicopter for supplies and manages to find some emergency rations. After eating a little, he prepares to move her back to his plane. Before leaving, he writes a message in case a rescue team arrives at the crash site. Using a rope, Michael carefully drags the woman back to his plane. Later, he learns her name is Maria, and she is from Thailand. When she briefly regains consciousness, he gives her some water. But as soon as she realizes the pilot didn't survive, she becomes distraught and faints again. While waiting for her to wake up, Michael decides to return to the wreckage to search for more supplies. Before leaving, he writes another message, hoping someone will find it. When Michael arrived at the wrecked helicopter, he tried to make use of the pilot's jacket, thinking it might be useful. After giving the pilot a simple burial, he quickly gathered all the remaining supplies that could still be used. Struggling to get inside the overturned helicopter, he carefully looked around and collected everything he thought he needed. He was relieved and excited when he found a snow slider, which could help him transport Maria more easily. Back at the plane, Michael realized that the helicopter pilot was actually Maria's husband, but there was nothing he could do. He then lit the portable gas stove he had taken from the helicopter and warmed his hands over the fire. After months of freezing cold, the warmth of the fire felt like a blessing. A moment later, Michael checked his map to figure out his exact location. After pinpointing it, he decided to head toward a seasonal station, even though it was extremely far from his current position. Just then, he heard a noise coming from his fishing rod. Rushing over, he carefully pulled it up and was overjoyed to see that he had caught a huge fish. Michael cooked noodles with the fish he had just caught. When Maria regained consciousness, he gently fed her. Noticing that she was still grieving, he tried to comfort her and said, "Life is worth fighting for. no matter how hard it gets. As time passed, Michael grew more worried about Maria's worsening condition. Holding her hand, he realized he had no choice. He had to take the risk and head to the seasonal station before it was too late. Knowing the journey would take several days, he carefully prepared supplies. He packed a few fish from his catch and other essentials. He then placed Maria on the snow slider and got ready to leave. After making all the necessary preparations, Michael took a deep breath, bracing himself for the long and dangerous journey ahead. Exhausted from walking, Michael eventually stopped to rest and gave Maria some water while she remained unconscious. He continued trekking through the icy hills, determined not to give up. As he moved forward, he frequently checked his surroundings and compared them to the map to ensure he was on the right path. When he finally confirmed his route, he pressed on. But to his shock, he realized that he had barely covered any distance. The station was still incredibly far away. As night fell, Michael dug into the snow to create a temporary shelter for them. Inside his makeshift igloo, he ate some fish to keep his strength up and carefully fed Maria as well. Eventually, Michael reached a large rock that marked a checkpoint according to his map. However, he knew the journey was still far from over. After some time, Michael panicked when he came across a dangerously steep rocky slope. Confused and desperate, he searched for an alternative route. Unfortunately, the safer path would take 5 days, while the dangerous one would take only 3. The problem was that the shorter route involved climbing a sheer cliff, a nearly impossible task, especially while carrying Maria, who was in critical condition. Before making a final decision, Michael decided to test the climb himself. Slowly and carefully, he started scaling the treacherous cliff, fully aware that one wrong move could be fatal. After climbing the steep cliff, Michael's journey finally becomes a bit easier. However, carrying Maria, someone he doesn't even know, makes things much harder for him. If he were alone, he could have moved much faster. But Michael, being someone with a strong sense of humanity, refuses to abandon Maria, even though she is unconscious and unable to help herself. Michael ties a rope to the snow slider and tries to pull Maria up. But because of the cliff's steepness and Maria's weight, he struggles. Several times he loses his grip, and at one point he even falls down. Luckily, he doesn't get injured. Completely exhausted, Michael ultimately has no choice but to give up on this route. It's just too difficult. This means he has to take a much longer path, adding 5 more days to his journey. Despite the setback, he chooses to stay with Maria and keep her safe, even though she's a stranger to him. As night approaches, Michael decides to rest in a rocky crevice. Like every night, he prepares the only food he has, fish. He also warms up some water and tries to help Maria drink it, worried about her worsening condition. With nothing else to do, Michael simply sits in silence, staring at the dark sky, waiting for sleep to take over. But just as he starts dozing off, a terrifying sound startles him, a bear growling outside. Panicked, Michael grabs an ice pick for protection. But before he can think of a plan, Maria suddenly starts coughing. It's the worst possible moment. Her coughing gives away their location. The polar bear roars and starts moving towards them, trying to squeeze into the rocky gap where they're hiding. With no other option, Michael quickly ignites a flare to scare the bear away. Thankfully, the bright flames work, and the bear runs off into the darkness. Michael breathes a sigh of relief, knowing how close they were to disaster. The next morning, Michael cautiously steps outside to check if the bear is still around. Once he feels it's safe, he continues his journey, pulling Maria along on the snow slider. She remains wrapped in thick blankets, sleeping soundly. However, as they move forward, a powerful blizzard suddenly strikes. The freezing wind is too dangerous to endure, forcing Michael to build a temporary wind shelter. To survive the extreme cold, he shares his body heat with Maria inside the blankets. The next day, Michael, now on the verge of frostbite, forces himself to keep going. The brutal cold slows him down, and doubts begin creeping into his mind. Several times he stops, wondering if he can even make it. As time passes, his condition worsens. With no other choice, he burns his own bag for warmth. Meanwhile, Maria shows no response to his attempts to wake her. She looks as if she's at death's door, and Michael, for the first time, feels completely lost. Days go by, and neither of them gets better. Maria's condition deteriorates further. She starts vomiting blood. When Michael checks her wounds, he is horrified to see that her stomach is badly infected. Realizing that Maria may not survive, Michael makes a heartbreaking decision. He gently places a photo of her family in her hands and, with deep sorrow, prepares to leave her behind. Michael prepared his snow slider, but this time, instead of Maria, it carried only his supplies. He hesitated for a moment, feeling uncertain about the decision he was about to make. As he continued his journey, the thick snow made the terrain even more treacherous. Suddenly, he lost his footing and fell into a deep crevice between the rocks. When he regained consciousness, panic set in as he realized he had fallen into a cave. As he attempted to leave, things got worse. His foot got trapped between the rocks. Desperate to free himself, Michael used all his strength to pull his leg out. The pain was unbearable, and he let out a loud scream as he finally managed to break free. Despite the severe injury to his foot, Michael forced himself to keep going. He crawled and limped his way through the cave, determined to continue his journey. But before leaving, he wanted to say his final goodbye to Maria. Guilt washed over him as he realized Maria was still alive. Tears streamed down his face as he apologized, knowing he had been ready to abandon her. But now, he made a promise. No matter what, he would never leave her behind, even if it meant his own death. After all, Maria ended up in this situation because the helicopter she was on had crashed while trying to rescue him. Before moving on, Michael checked his injured leg. The pain was unbearable, so he pressed snow onto his wound to numb it. With a limp, Michael pushed forward, determined to reach the rescue station despite the immense distance. When Maria suddenly coughed, he quickly gave her some water. But soon he realized their water supply had run out. Desperate, he resorted to eating snow to stay hydrated. As he continued his journey, he faced another challenge: a steep, snow-covered hill. Already exhausted, Michael struggled to find the strength to climb. When he finally reached the top, he spotted a rescue team patrolling in the distance. Hope surged through him as he hurried to carry Maria toward them. But it wasn't just the rugged terrain that made this difficult. His injured leg was getting worse. After dragging Maria up the hill, Michael desperately tried to signal the rescue team by lighting his last flare. But they didn't notice him. Seeing that the flare didn't work, Michael, now on the verge of collapse, set his jacket on fire, waving it frantically in the air, hoping the team would see him. His heart sank as he watched the rescue team fly away in their helicopter, unaware of his presence. Weak and defeated, Michael accepted his fate. Holding Maria close, he whispered that he would never leave her and thanked her for trying to save him. Just when all hope seemed lost, the rescue team finally spotted them. Michael and Maria were immediately evacuated and rushed to the hospital. And with that, the movie came to an end.